Good morning to those of you that are joining us on YouTube. It's great to be with you as well. I believe there are certain phrases which adults love to say, but kids love or hate to hear, right? Like certain things, authority figures, be it parents or coaches or teachers, they love to say them. And as kids, it just drives kids nuts to hear it, have those things said to them. Things like, because I said so, for example, right? That's a favorite, because I said so. Or maybe, I'm doing this for your own good, another popular one. Or when I was your age, and you know, we could go on, because even though all of us, or many of us probably let's admit it, use these phrases now as adults, we could at least think back to when we were younger and maybe how much we hated when these very same phrases were sort of quoted to us. But one of the phrases that I would like to see added to this list is the instruction, use good judgment. Use good judgment. Like when you're leaving the house or you're leaving a classroom and an adult shouts after you, use good judgment. Because here's the thing, even when I was a very immature teenager, I never once woke up, got out of bed, and thought, you know what I'm going to do today? I'm going to use the worst judgment possible and see what happens. Now, I understand that my parents, I'll admit it, my parents probably had good reason to think that maybe that's what I was actually doing. But I wasn't. I wasn't intentionally using bad judgment. It didn't always turn out. I was trying to use good judgment. It just didn't always turn out that way. And this is sort of my issue with the phrase, because telling someone to use good judgment is incredibly vague. So while it's a great goal and it's probably good, you know, a good thing to aim for in life, it's not always that helpful. But at the same time, I think we'd all probably agree just how important in life it is to use good judgment, especially, for example, when it comes to the people around us and the people we interact with on a regular basis. I mean, who hasn't seen, for example, the decisions of a friend or a family member and thought, should I speak up, or are they just going to think I'm judging them? Or who hasn't maybe got into some sort of relational difficulty with a spouse or a family member and thought, man, I would just love to give them a piece of my mind, but I really doubt that it will do any good. Or maybe you saw, you know, someone, a coworker at work who does something that seems maybe just a little bit out of line, and you really think, I should probably address that, but I'm not sure how to do it. These are all situations where good judgment is both incredibly important and also incredibly hard to come by. Because even when we sometimes think we're using it, it's not all that uncommon to look back and go, man, I wish I had used better judgment. So what do we do? Well, fortunately for us, these are some of the exact situations that the passage before us today wants to deal with, where Jesus, in this section of the Sermon on the Mount, is going to provide us not so much with instruction on how to use good judgment in general, but specifically with instruction on how to use good judgment in the lives of the people we interact with. The judgment details, if you will, for how we ought to relate to the people, to our neighbors, our coworkers, our family, and our friends, which is something I think all of us, if we're really honest with ourselves, is something we would all like to be better at, to get better at. So if you've not already, I'd like to invite you now to turn and join me in Matthew chapter 7 as we seek to learn how we might use good judgment in our relationships. Now, as we begin this morning, we're officially starting the third and the final chapter of the Sermon on the Mount. And over the course of the last 2 chapters or 2 months, whichever way you'd prefer to think about that, we've seen Jesus paint this incredible picture of what his coming kingdom will be like, how it works, how its citizens live, and even how we can be a part of that kingdom starting today. And this is very much what Jesus is going to continue on. That's sort of the same train of thought that he'll continue on this morning here in the opening verses of chapter 7. Now, if you have a Bible open in front of you, I want you to kind of scan over some of the previous sections of the Sermon on the Mount that we've covered in previous weeks, and I want us to note the progression of this sermon. Because all the way back in the beginning of the second half of Matthew chapter 5, Jesus described how we, as the citizens of his kingdom, would relate to the ancient law of God. Sort of how we would properly apply all the things that God had told us to do. Then in chapter 6, he described how we would relate to the world. How we ought to practice righteousness, how we would treat our possessions, or even as Pastor Chris talked about last week, how we would view the future and even the present in a way that was free of anxiety and stress and fear. And now, here in the beginning of chapter 7, Jesus is going to instruct us on how we are to relate to the people around us, or the people that we interact with. And so that's really what Jesus has been doing, sort of walking through, showing us how we, as his disciples, will relate to these different aspects of our lives. And this is what leads him to say in the very first verse of Matthew chapter 7, "Do not judge so that you won't be judged." Do not judge so that you won't be judged. Which, on the surface, seems really straightforward, does it not? Like maybe the simplest answer to using good judgment with the people in our lives is to simply withhold judgment altogether. I mean, that's sort of what this verse seems to be saying. And if this were the only verse we read this morning, then perhaps that would be the conclusion we would have to draw. But if we were to read on, even just say 14 verses further in this very same chapter of Matthew, we might find Jesus also warning us to be on your guard against false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravaging wolves. You'll recognize them by their fruit, which, if you think about it, really only seems like something we can do if we are exercising good judgment. How else will we spot the fruit of false prophets? Even further, if we were to keep reading in the New Testament, maybe we get all the way to the fourth book in the New Testament, the Gospel of John, we get to the 7th chapter, we would find Jesus instructing his disciples to stop judging according to outward appearances, rather judge according to righteous judgment. Another verse which on the face of it kind of seems to almost directly contradict the verse we just read in Matthew 7:1. So what gives? Does using good judgment really just mean withholding judgment altogether? Or is Jesus offering us a more nuanced view of judgment? Well, the truth is, I believe Scripture is pretty clear that the answer is the latter. And the part of the reason I believe that is on the basis of this very evidence that we have here in the beginning of Matthew chapter 7. Because it's here in this passage that Jesus gives us what I like to call a pre-judgment checklist. Now, before you laugh or make fun of me, let me explain. Because just like a pilot has a pre-flight checklist before they fly an airplane, or maybe a bus driver has a pre-trip inspection before they take off on their route, so we too must complete a pre-judgment checklist before we can ever hope to exercise good judgment. And it turns out this is exactly what Jesus is giving us here this morning. Things to sort of carefully consider before we go to pass judgment on someone else. So if we check off these things, then we can proceed with confidence. But if we skip over them, or we minimize them, or we ignore them, then we're virtually guaranteed to find ourselves in a position where we're looking back wishing we had used better judgment. So with the remainder of our time this morning, I'd like to give you the 3 checklist items that Jesus outlines in this passage. 3 things we must check in with before we can use good judgment in our relationships. Now, these are outlined in your bulletin in case you'd like to follow along. I'll give you the first one right now, as we've already started to see it in verse 1. Jesus says, before you pass judgment on someone else, first check your heart. First, check your heart. This is what Jesus means when he says, do not judge so that you won't be judged. For you will be judged by the same standard with which you judge others. And you will be measured by the same measure you use. In other words, good judgment always begins with a careful consideration of our heart's motivation. And if you've been with us for any number of the weeks here in this Sermon on the Mount series, this is hopefully something that is starting to sound sort of familiar. Because really from the very beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus has gone to great lengths to illustrate for us that our motivations matter. That's not just what we say or do that matters, it's why we are saying and doing those things that matters as well. And so it's probably no surprise then that this is also a critical element of exercising good judgment. Because judgment without self-reflection nearly always winds up being hypocritical. And this is what Paul is driving at in Romans 2, for example, when he writes, therefore, every one of you who judges is without excuse. For when you judge another, you condemn yourself, since you, the judge, do the same things. Or in the words of the wise and great theologian and pastor John Stott, if you enjoy the role of a judge, do not be surprised to find yourself in the place of the accused as well. Which are both great reminders because we are all prone to hypocritical judgment. But here's the thing. Most of us probably already know that, right? Most of us probably already know there's a difference between, say, correcting someone out of compassion versus criticizing someone from out of condemnation. Those are not the same things. That's not the hard part necessarily. The difficult part is being honest about our motivations, right? That's the harder part. We know there's a difference. The hard part is being honest with ourselves about what our true motivations are. Because let's face it, we know how to say the right things, right? We know how to preface our criticism with, I'm only telling you this because I love you. That's one of my favorites. Nothing good ever follows that statement. But it's always out of love. It's fascinating. We know how to preface our gossip with, I'm only saying this so you're aware. We know the right things to say, whatever the case may be. We kind of know how to almost subconsciously mislead ourselves and the people around us about our motivations. And yet, this is what we need if we're going to use good judgment. We need to be honest about our true motivation. And this is something that I was actually reminded of just a couple of weeks ago when my wife left to go pick up, as some of you know, to pick up her grandmother in Europe, and she left the girls and I home alone for a week, which I'm very glad to report. They're not here today, but that's not why they're not here. They're fine. It's all good. We're good. Everyone survived, I promise. But I was reminded of the very thing we're talking about repeatedly on more than one occasion during the week, because probably at least 15 times a day, one of my daughters would race into the room I was in with a very, very urgent information about whatever the other daughter was doing that she wasn't supposed to be doing, right? And if you're a parent, you know exactly what this is. It amounts to basically one child sprinting in completely breathless going, hey, Dad, did you know so-and-so is doing, and then you fill in the blank. And here's the thing. Out of all those 15 times, roughly 15 times a day, I think there was maybe one a day, and I'm being generous, where it was actually something that I needed to go deal with. Most of the time, maybe once, I was, okay, yeah, I need to stop her. But the majority of the time, the vast majority of the time, every other case, it was just an attempt to get the other sister in trouble. That's all it actually was. No, don't misunderstand me. The report was always made with great distress, great concern. Do you know what so-and-so's doing? It's really bad news. It was just a thinly veiled attempt to get the other sister punished. That's all it really was. And I think the reality is this actually reveals something quite significant about how to test our motivations. Because it shows us that when we seek to exercise good judgment in our relationships, we can test our hearts by asking ourselves, what is my desired outcome? What's the point? Where do I really want this to end, so to speak? In other words, am I seeking restoration and wholeness and healing and forgiveness? Is that what I'm aiming for? Or am I just trying to set somebody straight? Am I just trying to get even or sort of get them back for how they made me feel? Interestingly enough, later on in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus will instruct his disciples about how to deal or how to treat someone that has wronged them, that has sinned against them and sort of hurt them. And listen to what he says in Matthew 18. He says, if your brother sins against you, go tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have won your brother. Now, as Jesus continues, he outlines further steps to take if, hypothetically, the brother doesn't listen to you. But every single time, the goal is the same. It's restoration. It's healing. It's winning that person back. Therefore, when we seek to use good judgment in relationship to the people around us, we have to first check our hearts by asking, what do I truly want to come out of this? What am I truly trying to achieve here? And we've got to be as honest as we can with ourselves. So when your spouse wrongs you, when your coworker bends the rules, or your friend says something that really hurts your feelings, and you're about to pass judgment on what they've done, first stop and check your heart. Check your motivation. And then when you've done that, move down the pre-judgment checklist and check your life. First check your heart, then check your life. This is exactly where Jesus turns his attention when he continues in the next verse of Matthew 7. He says, why do you look at the splinter in your brother's eye, but don't notice the beam of wood in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take the splinter out of your eye, and look, there's a beam of wood in your own eye? Hypocrite, first take the beam of wood out of your eye, then you will see clearly to take the splinter out of your brother's eye. Now, this is really important because here again we see that Jesus is not just condemning judgment, period. He's condemning a very specific kind of judgment. In this case, bad judgment or hypocritical judgment. And the way he says we can avoid this, the stepping into this, is by checking our lives first. By starting with our lives before we move on to critique or judge other people. Because let's face it, if we're struggling with something, or as the illustration Jesus offers suggests, struggling with the very same thing to a much greater degree, then we're not going to be much help in helping the other person deal with it, right? We're not going to be able to help someone else deal with something that we very much are still actively dealing with. That's sort of the irony in what Jesus says here. If I have a hypothetical wooden beam in my eye, there's no scenario where I'm going to see clearly enough to help you deal with the splinter of wood in your eye. And this should make sense to us because if I don't know how to do something, why would I ever think I could teach it to you? Right? And so now I've shared this story before, but almost exactly 10 years ago, I got a job coaching track and field for a local high school where we were living at the time. Now, I didn't go in to try to get a job coaching track and field. I went in to try to coach football because that's what I wanted to coach. And the athletic director said yes, but he said, I need a long jump and triple jump coach for this upcoming track season. And then football season started the next school year. So he said, we'll talk about football later. Why don't you come and coach long jump and triple jump? Which I was on board with doing, except there was one sort of small problem. Maybe you could, I've never long or triple jumped, ever. So I can't teach it to other people. Nonetheless, for the next 3 seasons, I was, believe it or not, the high school's only long or triple jump coach, which is kind of a bummer for the kids because that meant for about 3 years, the extent of the coaching those poor jumpers got was jump further, because that was pretty much all I could say, all the advice I knew to give them. But all kidding aside, to this day, it reminds me of something Jesus said in Luke chapter 6, where he asked his disciples, can the blind lead the blind? Can the blind guide the blind? Won't they both fall into a pit? A disciple's not above his teacher, but everyone who's fully trained will be like his teacher. Meaning if I'm about to correct someone or judge someone for something I'm still actively trying to figure out in my own life, then perhaps the best judgment would be to just keep my mouth shut. Maybe seek help with that person, potentially. Because it's awfully hard to teach someone something that we don't know how to do ourselves. And I'll be honest, just personally, I think far too much of this goes on in our society and in the church in general. Not necessarily Parkside Church, just the global church. Because there's a very real human tendency to maximize other people's sin while minimizing our own. We all do it way too easily. And as much as I hate to admit it, I think some of the very sins that I am quickest to notice in other people and most annoyed by in other people are typically sins I struggle with the most regularly myself. And yet for some reason, that's the thing about other people that annoy me the most. So when you find yourself in a situation where you want so badly to pass judgment on someone else, to condemn, to criticize, maybe even to correct with good motivations, the first step towards good judgment is to check your heart. Ask yourself if your motivations are really what they should be. And then second, check your life. Are you actually in a position to help? Or is this just going to be a case of the blind leading the blind? And then thirdly and finally, check your audience. Check your audience. Now, I'll warn you up front, this comes from probably the most difficult verse in the entire passage this morning to sort of make sense of. Because in verse 6, Jesus says, "Don't give what is holy to dogs, or toss your pearls before pigs, or they will trample them under their feet, turn and tear you to pieces," which is a hard statement for a variety of reasons. But the simplest way to understand this illustration is to think of offering something incredibly valuable to someone you know cannot appreciate its worth. Offering something incredibly valuable to someone you know cannot appreciate its worth. My wife and I always chuckled when our daughters were little, how friends and family would very generously spend inordinate sums of money to buy them gifts and toys for their birthday, when what would inevitably happen? They would be more interested in the box and the wrapping paper that the toy came in, because they were just too young and too little to appreciate the value of what they had been given. And really, I think all of us have experienced this sort of thing, or we're familiar with this idea. We know, for example, we've all heard stories like that of a Philadelphia man who, back in 1989, bought a painting at a flea market for $4. Not because he liked the painting, just because he liked the frame around it. He got it home and he took the frame off and found behind the painting was one of the very first printings of the Declaration of Independence in almost pristine condition. And he would go on to sell this printing for $2.4 million just 2 years later. And we could go on, we could swap stories like this for quite some time, because we all know of cases where people treated something the wrong way because they didn't know its true value. They didn't understand what the value of it was. And in Scripture, wise counsel or good judgment is often regarded in the very same light. Proverbs 23:9, for example, says, "Don't speak to a fool, for he will despise the insight of your words," which is a statement that I think at first glance it might seem really harsh, but actually has a lot of wisdom behind it. Because the reality is sometimes, even when we have the very best of intentions, we can end up presenting that which is holy and true in a context that will elicit nothing but abuse and profanity. Sort of like almost like maybe standing on a street corner with a megaphone shouting, "God hates sinners." It might be true that God is angry about sin, but there's nothing godly about how we're presenting that message in that case. And what this passage shows us is that in order to use good judgment, we have to be thoughtful in considering how our advice will be received. So for example, there might absolutely be a time where you or I need to talk to someone who's wronged us or hurt us. Absolutely might be a time where I need to have a conversation with this person. But having that conversation on Facebook, probably not a good idea, is it? Just like similarly walking in the door after a long day of work and jumping straight in on critiquing your spouse for whatever they didn't do or didn't do correctly, probably isn't going to be received well. I know that one from personal experience. Because even if our intentions and our desires are good, sometimes our audience isn't. Or our audience isn't in a position where they can receive what we're trying to share with them. So if we truly want to exercise good judgment, then we won't just check our hearts and our lives. We'll also check our audience as well. We'll be mindful of who we are passing judgment on. That's what Jesus is calling us to do in this passage. And really, if we think about it, if we kind of reflect on all three of these things, we'll see this is exactly what Jesus himself does. As in, he's actually the first and greatest example of the good judgment we're talking about here in these verses. I mean, just very briefly, let's go back over these three things. Check your heart. What does Scripture say is the reason Jesus came, left his throne in heaven and came to earth? John 3:17 says, "For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him." Later on in the New Testament, Paul will say that Jesus came to reconcile all things to God through his death on the cross. So what was the true motivation of Jesus' heart? It was everything we talked about earlier. It was love, healing, restoration. What about his life? 2 Corinthians 5:21 says, though Jesus did not know sin, he became sin. Meaning he was the utter opposite of a blind guide. He became sin for us. So he's the only one whose life is without sin. As the final checklist item, all throughout the Gospels, we find Jesus repeating this phrase, some version of the phrase, "Let anyone who has ears listen," which, my friends, is nothing more than Jesus checking his audience. That's what he's doing here, calling the true citizens of his kingdom to hear his voice and follow his example. Meaning, when we reflect on these things, Jesus perfectly lives out every aspect of what he's calling us to do. Demonstrates without flaw what it looks like to exercise not just good judgment, but perfect judgment. So the most important question before us this morning is the one we'll end with. Will you and I follow his example? Will we hear his voice? Will we be his disciple? Because it's only through his life, his teachings, his death, and his resurrection that you and I can have any hope of responding and relating to the people around us as we ought to, as we should. Any hope of becoming a citizen of his kingdom and walking the path he calls us to walk. It's the only chance that you or I have of doing any of this is through Jesus. Would you pray with me? Almighty God, forgive us for all the ways we judge incorrectly. The hypocritical judgment, the fault finding, the way we judge poorly. God, you and you alone judge perfectly. Would you fill us with your Spirit that we might follow the example of your Son? Would we check our hearts and our lives, our audience, before we venture to correct? Would we always be mindful of the grace and mercy we have received through Jesus? And would you empower us to follow him? We ask all these things in his holy and precious name.